Well, no doubt you've heard about the digital dollar. Everybody's talking about it now, these central bank digital currencies. Well, what is this really about? That's what I'm going to talk about on this episode, and how it's not really about efficiency and ease of payments, but it's really about tyranny and control. You're going to be surprised, and we're going to talk about uh, the dollar collapse that people are talking about as well. Is that going to be happening? We're going to talk about an incredible verse in the book of Revelation and how that's relevant to this topic. And we're going to talk about how it's really about surveillance. And we're going to talk about some legislation right now in the US. So let's get into it right now. Hello and welcome to Cutting Edge Faith. I'm Ryan Howard, and this podcast is here to help bring you the truth behind the headlines and help equip your faith so that you can navigate the cultural chaos of today. So let's get right into this. Now, there is a lot to unpack here, and there's some groundwork that I think is really important to understand how we got to this situation. What's the deal with the dollar? It's very strong. Everybody's using it. Why is it a concern? What's a reserve currency? What's going on there? And so I want to give just a little bit of history here real quick before we get into this, but don't worry, we're going to cut to the chase real quick. Now, I've done some currency trading. I work in global procurement in the manufacturing industry, and obviously I'm doing this podcast and all that as well, and speaking as well. But we have, I also did currency trading in the past, and so I spent thousands of dollars, got trained up, able to trade currencies, dollars for euros or whatever other currency it may be. And that sort of has really informed me about the reality of the monetary and financial systems around the world and the central banks and how things work and how money really flows. And I've also worked in global business as well. Like I mentioned, I've done $55 million contracts. I've worked with China, India. I've worked with Italy, Spain, France, Switzerland. I've worked with many different countries. I've worked with Brazil and Argentina, in North America as well, Canada and Mexico. And so lots of global experience. So I understand how payments are made. I understand how the monetary systems work. I understand how we make these deals and these trade deals. Now, I'm not talking government to government. I'm doing obviously business to business, but there are similar principles at play. You're moving money around the world. And so we're also going to talk about cryptocurrency and how that's not the same thing as a digital dollar or a central bank digital currency. That's really critical to keep in mind. Now, let's talk about the dollar. Now, you might have heard the collapse of the dollar or these different things happening that are going to affect the dollar. Well, obviously, we've seen inflation in the US, and that's a big concern. But what is going on with the dollar? Well, right now, the dollar is the US dollar is the currency of global business. So not every trade agreement, but almost every agreement I have done is to do business in dollars. Now, for a large multinational corporation, they may or may not want to, but for governments, many of them are holding dollars as a reserve currency. What does that mean? That just means basically it's money they have on hold so that they can buy things in dollars. I mean, it's really as simple as that. And why would the major countries in the world, most of them, have the dollar as their reserve currency? Well, it is a trusted currency. It's a very trusted currency. And that is because over 70% or around 70% of transactions done around the world involve the dollar. Now, international payments, or if you're buying something from another country, you're going to pay in dollars, or you're going to pay in that country's currency, or a third country's currency, which there's very few cases where you would want to do that. But that happens with the dollar. Now, how did this happen? Well, back in 1942, we had what's called the gold standard. So the dollar was tied to gold as the value to determine the value of the dollar. And in 1971, President Nixon took us off the gold standard, which means it became a fiat currency or a freely floating currency. And so now it's not something that's tied to anything. And now all these other currencies basically tied themselves to the dollar because the dollar was this big currency that was used everywhere. And why is that? Well, in 1973, we had something called the petrodollar. And this was an agreement between the US and Saudi Arabia to price oil in dollars. And so what that means is that if anybody wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they needed to have US dollars. And so what does that mean? Well, every country's buying oil. And so now the petrodollar, that's where all oil is bought and sold in dollars. US dollars. Now, again, I mentioned 70% of the transactions around the world are done in dollars. Now, the reason I mentioned about currency trading is because when I'm trading currencies, I'm looking at the strength of a nation versus another nation. What's their import, export? What's their debt? Do they have internal debt, external debt? What is the business transactions? Like for New Zealand, you might follow the dairy industry and know what's going to happen there. You can see what's going to happen with the currency. There's fluctuations. Some currencies are tied together. Australia, you watch what's happening in China. You can make trades that way as well. And so that's called a fundamental analysis. Then you have technical, where you look at charts and all that sort of stuff. But then you have what's called sentiment, which is what's happening today, what's happening this week. That's more of a short-term bias in the market. And so when we look at the U.S., it's actually got very poor fundamentals. It actually, all this debt, all this political instability, all that sort of stuff, it should not be a strong currency. But it is, because everybody's using the currency and everybody trusts the currency. And that's why it's the world's reserve currency, because everybody's doing these transactions in dollars. Now, I worked with Brazil, and we have I had a company that I was working with there, and they have very high interest rates in Brazil. And this was maybe 8 years ago or so. And what they had was if they could get their revenue to be in dollars, not in Brazilian reais, then they could get global rates for interest. And so they had an incentive to actually sell their products made in Brazil in dollars. And so we did our contract in dollars. So if they got about 50%, they could get global rates, better pricing for their customers, all that sort of stuff. And so, yes, it really matters what we're doing business in. Now, I bring all this up to point out that you may or may not have heard, but you should be aware of this, that China recently made a deal with Russia to buy and sell and trade in Chinese yuan, in their currencies, not in dollars. And they also made a deal with Saudi Arabia to buy oil without dollars, with the Chinese yuan. And they also made a deal with Brazil to trade without dollars, with the Brazilian real and the Chinese yuan, or renminbi, the Chinese renminbi. And it's the same currency. One is it's just a different way of referring to it. Now, that's a big deal. Now, does that mean that the dollar is going to be tanking overnight? No. And I don't think we're going to see a currency, the yuan, going to become the new currency, reserve currency, because people don't trust it. I mean, Europe's not going to do it. Japan's not going to do it. Those are major centers also of these financial flows as well. There's several major banks around the world that you follow with this sort of stuff. But it is concerning because, we see countries saying, hey, we're not going to use the dollar. I mean, look at what's happening in America today. It's crazy, and a lot of instability. And we see a lot of things happening from this regime leading our country now that are not in the best interests of our nation. And so it's actually something that is quite concerning, and we want to make sure that we're paying attention to it. Now, I mentioned that, I mentioned it's the reserve currency. So we got through that. And so this is happening. Now, there may be a new reserve currency coming. Maybe it's going to be a basket of currencies from the BRICS countries, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But these are, this is yet to be seen. But what we do see is the dollar being sort of removed, at least in a few of these cases. Now, I don't necessarily think the dollar is going to collapse. I think that it could potentially be significantly devalued. But I think our government is too willing to let that happen. Now, because then they can bring in this new digital dollar, and they can just say, well, look, nobody's using it now. It's going down. Let's just get rid of it, and we can use this digital dollar instead. And I'm going to talk to you about why that's a major concern. It's a major concern. Well, let's just cut to the chase. It's because it's about, they can track every transaction that's done. And I'll get into that in just a minute. But a lot of people are comparing the digital dollar to cryptocurrency. It is not the same as cryptocurrency. Now, cryptocurrency is decentralized. That means you and I can make a transaction without a third party. We don't need a bank. We don't need the federal government. We don't need anybody. I can have my digital or my cryptocurrency wallet. You have yours. We send it directly back and forth. That's like Dogecoin, Bitcoin, all those sorts of things. Now, we don't need a third party to facilitate that payment. but we do with a digital dollar. It's a centralized payment. So that means every transaction would go through the federal government. So you have one bank that everybody can use. Well, many banks, but it's one system. So every transaction would be tracked. Now, if you've heard the term blockchain, that is literally just a public ledger. So a bank, you go to a bank, you do a transaction, they've got a ledger, every transaction that they do. Well, the blockchain is a public ledger that cannot be altered. And so it's a concern. And if they are trying to block that, to take that away. And I want to talk about infrastructure. Okay, so public infrastructure, you've got roadways, we can drive our cars wherever we want to go on these bridges and roads and all that sort of stuff because we have that public infrastructure. Now, we have many new media corporations and media outlets because we have the public infrastructure of the internet. And so without the public infrastructure of the internet, we wouldn't be able to have all of those. I wouldn't be able to broadcast like this for you to watch or listen to now. And so we'd have that issue. Well, the blockchain is a decentralized payment infrastructure. So the Internet of Things and all that sort of stuff, these connections and everything, it's decentralized. There's no central government or central agency or regulator that can control anything with it. They can't manipulate it like the interest rates like they do today. And we need to have that. And so we can't let that go. And otherwise, you need a third party bank to do any transaction. So right now, we can use money. I can give you cash. You can give me cash. Okay. I can give you cryptocurrency. You can give me cryptocurrency. We don't need any bank to be involved. If I want to write a check, okay, you got to go to a bank to cash it, but I can give you money directly without any third party at all. Now, it will not be possible to do that with a digital dollar. Okay. Everything would go through the central bank, through the federal system, like I mentioned. And this is already in the works. It's called the FedNow system. And it's already been here. I'm recording this in April 2023, and it's already coming out. They're already moving forward with this. And like I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit later about the legislation attached to some of this stuff. But, there is something called, I mentioned this infrastructure. We've got a vast infrastructure with money everywhere. We can use it. There's no single point of that we all need to go through to use money. Now, we can just keep it with us and use it as we need. Now, in order for us to continue to have that, well, we need money, and we need another public infrastructure form of payment, which is like the cryptocurrency, the blockchain. And so what they want to do is with this digital dollar, they would have a single point where we would be able to make and do these payments. And so what that means is there's one point where it can be stopped. There's one point where it can be blocked, and we're going to talk about that here in just a minute. But we have other things that have been hacked. We've had vehicles been hacked into and driven off the road or force stalled, turn the engine off. We have baby monitors that have been hacked. Pacemakers that have been hacked. I mean, this is because it's called a single point of failure. So it's one point. It's like a choke. It's like a funnel. Everything goes down to this funnel and has to flow through the bottom. All you got to do is watch the bottom of that funnel. But if you had hundreds of thousands of funnels, well, obviously you couldn't watch all of those funnels. And so that's what we want to avoid, is having just one funnel. And that's where this is going with this central bank digital currency. Now, I want to talk about what this is really about. And it's really about mass surveillance. And why would I say that? Well, like I mentioned, you would have the government involved in every financial transaction. That means if you send money to your friend, if you want to pay your neighbor for helping you do something in your yard, or help, if you want to sell your couch or whatever it is, you need the federal government involved in that. Now, if you give to the Donald Trump campaign, the federal government is going to be involved in that. And why is that a concern? Well, in China, and this is something I found out about 5 years ago. In China, they have facial recognition cameras everywhere. And if somebody jaywalks, that camera will recognize their face and the government system will automatically pull out the money from their account. That's the fine for jaywalking. There's no discussion. It just happens. That's exactly right. And that was 4 or 5 years ago. And so that technology has advanced since then. And that was already in place. Now, I mentioned that they can stop transactions that they don't want to have happen. Now, how do we know that? Well, let's see what happened in China. Last year, 2022, 23 million times China stopped the purchase of plane and train tickets and other products because a Chinese citizen, had a quote, poor social credit score. Social credit score. What is that? Well, I've talked about that on a lot of other episodes. I would encourage, just go to my site, ryanshoward.com, and type in China, and you'll see all those episodes, or go to the whatever MP3 or podcast player you listen to, and you can find it there as well. But it's a social credit system, which means that if they speak against the government, they get a hit. If they go to some Christian church, they get a hit. If they don't, if they do, there's a whole list of things. And if they search online for something that they like, if they got a Bible, if they got all this stuff, they get a hit. And then they can't get education for their kids. They can't get bank loans. They can't start businesses. They can't do all kinds of stuff. And even getting locked out of their apartment because they have to use a phone now and have red or green. It's from the COVID system, and they got to get in their apartment. You got to get green. That's why there's a huge homeless growth in China right now, because of that. They got to have this app to get into their own apartment building, and they get locked out because it tracked them somewhere they weren't supposed to be. And the government says it's a COVID risk zone, but really they didn't like something else in their social credit score, something else going on there. And that's exactly what this is leading to. And that's what they want to do. Now, China, or I mentioned China, Canada froze bank accounts of demonstrators who were protesting the jab mandates. That was not that long ago, in the last 18 months. Brazil threatened to do the same when there were protesters coming against the stolen election, where Bolsonaro really won and Lula stole the election. Obviously, he's a best friend with China. I mentioned that a few months into his presidency, and now he's already making a deal with China. Now, PayPal in the US, they've threatened to withdraw funds for anybody caught promoting racism and misinformation. What a subjective general statement to make. That's just ridiculous. So, well, why would they do that? Well, if people have the wrong views, they can take money out of the account with this digital dollar. They can see everything. They can just automatically take it. They can block certain transactions. They can make the money expire, like a use it or lose it type thing. And it's insane. It's absolutely insane. And there's no way that this should be the direction that we're going. But unfortunately, that's the way it's going. But you and I need to be awake. We need to have our eyes wide open so that we can understand the reality of what's going on here. Now, there's a verse that I want to talk about. It's Revelation 13, 16 to 17. No doubt you've heard this, but I'm just going to read it quick and then we'll talk about this. It says, also, it causes all, both great and small, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. That is the name of the beast or the number of its name. Now, do I think that the digital dollar is the mark of the beast? No, not necessarily. No. But of course, God knows everything. And they're talking about already chips to be put in the right hand. It's actually already happening. Even companies are doing that so people can get in. Amazon or these different stores, you can pay with your palm, all kinds of stuff. You see all of these systems being centralized. They're talking about putting remote kill switches in vehicles. In like Ford, they actually are doing this. They already talk about this, where they can put kill switches in all these vehicles and they can be centrally shut down. And why do you think that they want to go to all electric? Because they can all be centrally shut down. They can all be controlled. What the Biden administration is incentivizing to have charging stations put in every new construction. They're giving these huge tax breaks and benefits to get this done. So, of course, companies are doing it, whether it's a new retail store or whether it's a new condo complex, whatever it is, because it's all bringing central control. And there's not even enough lithium, or not lithium, these lithium batteries. There's not even enough rare earth minerals to make enough batteries for all the cars that would be needed. And and that's a whole nother episode that we need to talk about. But that's where this is all going. And you see, I believe that my thought is, the U.S. is letting all this stuff happen, letting China broker deals in Iran with Iran and Saudi Arabia and India and Russia and Brazil and all this happening because our leadership here in the U.S. does not have our best interest in mind. They've got their own pockets in mind. Peter Schweitzer wrote a book called Red-Handed: How the American Elite Get Rich Helping China Win. And there's this big, massive puppeteering happening everywhere. And well, we need to have our eyes wide open. And you're listening to this podcast, you're getting the truth behind the headlines so you can grow your faith. You can keep your eyes on the Lord so you can have your eyes wide open and you can navigate this cultural chaos we have today here around the world. And you can see what's really happening here. Now, I mentioned that verse because it says, so that no one can buy or sell unless they have the mark. Now, 114 countries representing 95% of the global economy are exploring or have already implemented a central bank digital currency, CBDC. That means 95% of the world's economy is already looking at centralizing your ability to pay your neighbor something or to donate to the Trump campaign or to donate to my campaign or to donate to this podcast or to buy a coaching session or to buy your groceries or to travel to a certain state or to buy a plane ticket or buy all of that. All of these 95% of the global economy. So 114 countries represent, okay, there's 195 countries or so, and 114 of those represent 95% of the global economy. Okay, all looking to centralize this. Okay, that should make us think. The Bible has a way of, God has a way of saying things in a way that are timeless, where it makes sense thousands of years ago, it makes sense today, it makes sense thousands of years from now, because that's the way God does things. And we see some patterns showing up here. We see some groundwork being laid here. I just told you how China 23 million times last year stopped the free purchase of plane tickets, of train tickets, and other just general products. They already are doing it. They're already automatically taking money out of somebody's account for jaywalking based on facial recognition. So let's open our eyes here, okay? And we need to be ready to stand. And that's really why I want to get you. We need to wake up. We need to be ready to stand. Are you going to stand for values? Here in America, we're talking about whether we should use pronouns and all this sort of stuff, getting distracted by all this stuff. And it's important. That was important enough for me to talk about. I did an episode on that. I recommend you go check that out. Very enlightening about love and truth. Got to have truth with love. So the argument for this FedNow service and all these CBDC, central bank digital currencies, is that for efficiency and so-called equity, and so that there's no racism with people who want to go get loans and all this. Like, how about we just talk about credit worthiness, and versus skin color? They want to make everything about skin color, but it's about efficiency and ease of payments, and it's going to not have errors, and it's going to work well. Just like everything else the government does, right? They say it'll stop money laundering and illegal activity, but these are all a facade. It's about surveilling and controlling the behavior of Americans. That's what this is about. And that's what it is about everywhere around the world. So don't take the bait. Don't fall for this. That's not what it's about. Brazil already has this. It's called PIX, P-I-X. It's a central bank payment system. It's not necessarily a currency, but it's a payment system run by the central bank. So all the transactions already go through that. So not going to be looking to use that FedNow service. No, thank you. Well, now I just found out recently you can't even use cash. You cannot use money to go to certain national parks and certain federal grounds and those sorts of things that you can get into, museums and that sort of stuff. Wow, it's happening. So we need to keep this alive. You need to let your legislators know to support this legislation I'm going to talk about here. So let's get into that right now. So it's called HR 1122, the CBDC, that is Central Bank Digital Currency, CBDC Anti-Surveillance State Act. So that's an act that basically says that the central bank can't come up with any digital currency. They cannot issue a product to the American people. That is not the job of the federal bank. That is not the job of the U.S. government to offer products to people. That's absurd. So this would block that. Now we have states taking act. Now that's at the federal level or at the down in Washington or in D.C. We have states like South Dakota and Christie also taking South Dakota, Christie Noem is the governor in South Dakota, and we have Florida, Ron DeSantis taking action there. So Christie Noem recently vetoed a bill. Their legislature, I don't know how this happened, but they pushed through legislation that would change the definition of money to exclude cryptocurrency and include central bank digital currency. You got to be kidding me. It's the opposite. It should be including cryptocurrency because that is actually a decentralized form of money that you and I can use together and fluctuates with the market. Yeah, it's still new in the last few years, but there's only a certain amount that can be quote printed as a cryptocurrency. There's only a certain amount that can be created, and so the value stabilizes over time and as it gets acceptance. But the digital dollar, well, right now they print money. It's a fiat currency. Remember, fiat, it's freely floating. It's not really tied to anything. And so that's why they can manipulate it so easily with the interest rates and all these different things, printing more money, which quantitative easing, if you've heard of that, that's a fancy way of saying printing more money. And we have a debt economy here in the US where for every dollar that's created, there's $2 created of debt because just the way the system is set up. A bank, if I take $100,000 and I put it in a bank, that bank can loan, only has to have 10% reserves. I think it's even less now. They can loan $1 million based on the $100,000 that I gave them. So that's money created as debt. Do you see what happens there? And then people get those loans for the $1 million and they bring that back and take 10 times that. So now you've got $10 million that is created as debt from that 1 million, and debt creates debt, creates debt, creates debt. Like, that's just insane. And so that's what it is. We have a debt economy. And that's why just with the way things are, it's not going to change. And so obviously there's no incentive for these leaders who want to line their pockets to fix this or to make it work. And so, hey, let's blow the system up. And then we got an excuse to come up with a new digital currency and say, hey, look, we're here to save the day. Oh man, I can't believe this. The economy crashed. There's nothing we could do except for all the levers that they pulled to make it crash and to make inflation high. And that actually set up the crisis. It's like setting a fire and then selling somebody a fire extinguisher. That's exactly what this is. I mean, that's a perfect analogy for this. Now, Florida also is Ron DeSantis, the governor there, is calling on the legislation to ban centralized digital currency. So we really need this to be happening, and you need to tell your legislators this. Again, that's called the HR 122 CBDC Anti-Surveillance State Act. That needs to go. That needs to go through. That is good. That is banning the central bank digital currency, which will bring this tyrannical centralized control. And we also. Florida as well. So we need our states to be taking action on this as well, not changing the definition of money to exclude cryptocurrency and to include a digital central bank digital currency. Insane. So what they want is a cashless society. So you need the federal government in everything. And when that becomes a reality, financial privacy is lost. Nobody will be able to buy or sell without submitting to the dictates of the system, whatever it might be. And there'll be shadow banning where you'll have no explanation. It'll say, oh, well, you went to this area and we knew. It'll say someone went to this area. We knew there was COVID there or some other new disease or whatever they come up with. And so therefore can't make this transaction or can't buy this thing or can't buy this ticket, plane ticket, or can't come into this stadium. But really what's happening is they know you gave to this other campaign or you gave to this nonprofit or you sent money here or you sent money there because they have visibility to all that. And so this has implications, which I think I've explained here. Now, this is something that is just, we need to be awake. We got to be aware and we need to let other people know as well. I try to keep this tight. We're at close to 30 minutes but there's a lot to unpack here. There's so many episodes we can make out of this as well, but I hope this has been informative for you. I hope you will take action. I want to know what questions you want to have. Now, for those of you listening to this, I am putting these on YouTube now, doing videos each week. And for if you're on YouTube, you can also get this at any of the podcast stores as well, podcast apps. It's Cutting Edge Faith again. And thank you so much for joining. There's a lot more to unpack on this, but let's have our eyes wide open. We know God is in control, and we should be motivated more than ever to be coming close to him, to having intimacy with him, digging into the Bible, digging in worship, having time with the Lord every day, listening prayer, hearing from him. If you haven't given your life to Jesus Christ, well, today is the day. If we knew Jesus was coming back in the next 72 hours, what would we change in our life? Well, that's a sobering thought. And I want to invite you to think about that. All right. Well, thank you for joining. God bless. Visit ryanshoward.com to hear more episodes and to get in touch with me as well. Thank you. God bless. And we'll see you in the next episode.